This really happened to me, not something I dreamed up, not a rumor or a tale borrowed from someone else. It happened in my own bloodline, in my own home, and even now retelling it makes my throat dry. The paper sat on the oak kitchen table under the dim light, its edges crisp, its ink bold. But the signatures at the bottom, my name, scrawled there 3 times, were not mine. My own children, the ones I raised, the ones who hugged me as little kids, had forged my hand to steal what I had worked for my entire life. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I remember the first time I saw my signature on that stack of legal documents. I froze. The penmanship was good, but I knew my hand, my pressure, the rhythm of my loops. These weren't mine. The papers were deeds, powers of attorney, and even authorization slips that allowed access to my accounts, and the people who had faked it all were the ones I loved most. But let me start a little further back, because betrayals like this don't happen in a flash. They build slowly like a crack in the wall, spreading wider every day until the whole house threatens to collapse. My name is Robert, though most people who know me call me Bob. I was born and raised in Toledo, Ohio, and after decades of working union shifts at the Jeep plant and saving every nickel, I retired comfortably. By 72, I wasn't wealthy, but I had enough: a paid-off house on the west side, a pension, Social Security, and a bit of savings I was proud of. For a man who grew up poor, I considered myself lucky. My wife Helen had passed 6 years before this all began. She was the glue that kept our family civil. Without her, I noticed little fractures forming. My daughter Lisa started visiting less. My son Mark, once affectionate, began asking more often about what happens when you're gone. At first, I thought it was grief. Later, I realized it was greed. The story really began one Sunday morning at a diner on Monroe Street where Lisa asked me to meet her for breakfast. She smiled, that sugary smile that had always reminded me of her mother, but there was something off in her tone. She leaned across the Formica table and asked, "Dad, have you thought about getting your paperwork in order? You know, just in case something happens." I chuckled, trying to brush it off. Lisa, 70. 2 not 100, I still cut my own grass. But she pushed gently at first, then with more persistence. "It's just easier if you've got everything lined up. Will's accounts, all that. We could help you." At the time, I thought she was being responsible. I didn't know she already had other plans in motion. The months that followed were strange. I began receiving calls from the bank about authorization forms I had supposedly signed. At first, I thought it was a clerical mistake. Then I noticed little things like my checkbook being out of place, or a letter from my credit union that mentioned an account change I didn't remember. One evening, I brought it up to Mark when he stopped by. He was fiddling with his phone, barely looking up. "Hey, do you know anything about this?" I asked, holding out the letter. He took it, scanned it for 2 seconds, and shrugged. "Dad, you probably just forgot you signed something. Don't worry about it." That "don't worry about it" should have been my warning bell. But when it's your own kids, your mind doesn't jump to betrayal. You want to believe in them. You want to believe they wouldn't hurt you. Then came the day I received a notice in the mail from a title company. It congratulated me on the successful transfer of my house. My house. The home I'd lived in for 40 years. I felt my heart stutter as I read it again and again. At first, I thought it was fraud from some stranger. Then I saw the signatures. My name scribbled across 3 different lines. It was my children's handwriting, disguised as mine. They had sold my house right out from under me, while I still lived in it. I sat in that kitchen chair, the paper trembling in my hand, and for the first time in my life I thought, my own flesh and blood are trying to erase me. The next morning I walked into my lawyer's office downtown. Head handled small things for me over the years. Nothing big. I laid the papers on his desk and said, "These are forged. My kids did this." He raised an eyebrow. "Are you certain, Bob?" I pointed at the signatures. "That's not my hand, and I never authorized any of this. They're trying to steal everything from me." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Then, well, make sure they regret it." And that's when I decided if my own children wanted a war over what was mine, then at 72 years old, I was damn well going to give them one. The night I made that decision, I slept in the house they thought they'd stolen, staring at the ceiling fan, spinning slowly above me. I whispered into the dark, "You picked the wrong man to betray." Because if they wanted to play with forged signatures, I was about to show them what a real signature could do. This is a non-story instruction. This is the first chunk 1,600 words target, but shortened here for pacing. Do you want me to continue directly into the next chunk, where suspicion grows, and the discovery deepens bank, accounts false witnesses, and the children's arrogance, until the turning point? You said, "Continue." ChatGPT said, "This really happened to me, not something I made up, not a rumor picked off the street. It happened in my kitchen, under the same dim light, where I'd taught my kids to peel potatoes and mend shirts. Saying it aloud still tastes like iron in my mouth." The paper sat on the oak kitchen table under the dim light, its edges crisp, its ink bold, but the signatures at the bottom, "Me name," scrawled there 3 times, were not mine. My own children, the ones I raised, the ones who sat on my knee and called me Dad, had forged my hand to steal what I had built for 4 decades. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The first chunk of fury was confusion. The second was disbelief. The third turned into a slow, cold focus. I spent that week like a man learning to walk again. Tentative testing, watching for traps I couldn't march into their lives. Screaming evidence was a slow, careful thing. If you accuse, you better have the receipts. So I started collecting them. I went back to the credit union on Reynolds Road, the same place where I'd cashed my first paycheck in 1969, and asked for copies of any forms signed in the last 6 months. The teller's eyes narrowed when I said I was disputing signatures, and she asked me questions that made me feel ridiculous. "You sure you didn't sign these, Mr. Hayes?" I told her yes. She led me to a small office where a manager photocopied page after page, and the machine hummed like it was trying to swallow the truth whole. The authorizations were immaculate. They looked like legal forms. A lawyer might draft notarized, stamped, countersigned. Somebody had done their homework. The signatures on the bank forms didn't wobble like mine. They had a practiced loop where I habitually made a hook, and a pressure that dug into the paper in a way mine never did. I knew my hand better than anyone I saw. Tiny flourishes that only someone imitating me would add to make it seem real. It was obvious, but to a layman, it would pass. At the county recorder's office on Jackson Street, Mrs. Alvarez, the woman who handled deeds for years, took one look at the transfer and frowned. "This is fast work," she said, tapping the file. "Everything recorded the same week. Who handled your signing, Mr. Hayes?" When I told her I hadn't signed anything, she grew more guarded. "We can pull the originals," she said. "But if it was notarized, you'll want to talk with a title company and a lawyer. People can get creative." That's when I hired someone who would become my closest ally in what came next. a retired handwriting analyst named Clara Nguyen. I had found her listed in a Toledo directory of experts at 70. She ran a small practice from a converted former bank office near the Maumee River. She smelled faintly of lemon and cigarette smoke and had an eye like a jeweler's loupe. Clara laid out the documents on her metal table and did not look at me with pity. She treated the paper like witnesses. "They didn't just forge your signature," she said, after a long minute, tapping her magnifier. "They traced a model. See the hesitation marks, and the pressure pattern is inconsistent across strokes. Whoever did this used an exemplar, maybe a check or an old note, and traced it slowly. There are also indentations here. Someone pressed hard while forming those letters. They wanted to be confident. The copy looked aged." She tapped the corner of my deed, but they rushed the notarization. Rushed. That word put a picture in my head. Hurried hands a late night. Meeting a notary on the take. I had pictured my kids calmly sitting at a conference table signing papers, like respectful adults. The reality smelled cheaper like the back room of a motel. I started to stitch together timelines. Movers had shown up on a Tuesday and carted a few things in the middle of the night boxes of old newspapers. My late wife's framed recipes. My neighbor across the street. Mrs. Klein swore she'd seen a dark SUV idling at the curb around 2 a.m. She was the sort of woman who noticed when a porch light burned out. Her testimony felt like a bell in a quiet room. When I confronted Lisa about the deed, she adopted the posture she'd always used when she wanted to make me feel small and sensible. Leaning back fingers laced a calm voice, like sour milk. "Dad," she said, "we had to take action. You were getting forgetful. You left your checkbook in the drawer, and your power of attorney was messy. We did what any responsible children would do." Her eyes slid to Mark, who sat at the kitchen counter and scrolled his phone, like he owned my silence. That was the moment the villain's power felt real. They had the law on their side, or at least had arranged the paperwork to make it appear that way. They had friends, a notary named Tom, who helped out at odd hours. They had money flowing through accounts I had never heard of, and a title company that processed transfers without blinking. In their version, I was an old man, being helped to plan for the future. In mine, they were thieves, with practiced hands and warm smiles. But arrogance is a weakness. They carried theirs like a cloak, parading in front of neighbors with the insolence of people who think the law is a set of suggestions. "We're taking care of Dad," Lisa told Mrs. Klein with a saccharine smile. He wanted things settled. I could see her fingers flex when she talked, as if she were counting invisible stacks of paper. There were other signs I had missed earlier. Small, stupid things. My mail had been rerouted to a P.O. box on West Central. A power card I used at the grocery had been replaced with another chip. A retirement check, small but sacred, had a different routing number attached to it for 2 months. Mark made excuses. They upgraded our payroll. That's probably a bank error, and then he would go quiet when I pressed. The decision point came the day I found an internal email Mark had accidentally left open on the family laptop. He'd been careless, sloppy with a password, and the screen still glowed when I walked into the den to water a plant. The subject line read, "Reclosing tomorrow." His tone was brisk professional. "Tom will notarize at 11. Bring the originals. Lisa to handle the title transfer. Well be done by Friday. Attachment invoice PDF." I did what any man who had been cornered and still had pride to lose would do. I printed that email and took it trembling down to Clara. She read it with a practiced, dry face. "You can't forge an email," she said, "but you can use them to show intent. This proves premeditation." It was small but important. It shifted the picture from maybe to organized. with Clara's handwriting report, the county records documents, the witness statements from Mrs. Klein, and that careless email. I walked back into my lawyer's office with a pack of evidence that made him whistle. "Lo, you've got more than I expected," he said, rifling through the papers. "If the notary is compromised and the signatures are demonstrably forged, we can file an injunction, put a lease pendens against the property, and seek criminal charges. We'll need to move fast." He wrote down a list of steps: forensic copies, subpoenas for bank records, a demand letter. His pen moved like a metronome. Legal maneuvers are surgical. We filed a temporary restraining order the next week and a notice of Ellis pendens with the county recorder, effectively slamming a legal ice pack on any attempt to transfer the title again. I remember the clerk asking me if I was sure. I nodded. "I'm sure," I said. "My kids forged my name and tried to take my house." That evening I watched them through the blinds, like a man spying on his own reflection. They came by to check in bright with fake concern. Lisa hugged me too long, smelling like cheap perfume. Mark sat us down at the kitchen table and spoke with the practiced concern of a man used to giving orders. "Dad, we just want what's best. We thought you'd be safer if we handled the bills." He smiled like a politician, wetting palms for applause. I let them talk. I let them reveal by their own words and gestures how deep they thought their power ran. Their arrogance had an odor. It was the same I smelled years ago when union men tried to shortchange me on overtime. It stung, but it was also a map. People who believe they can get away with wrongdoings make mistakes, double-counting arrogant boasts, reused tactics. The first mistake came when Lisa, in a fit of complacency, used my home phone to call the title company and ask about the status of a small deposit. She forgot to hang up the speaker. The woman on the other end thought she was speaking to a family member and let slip a name, Tommy, at Central Title, and a mention of an off-the-record fee to speed things along. Clara and I wrote it down. It was another thread. We started pulling threads. I went to the post office and with a clerk's help requested a change of address history. I sat in the dingy little room while worksheets printed out, and I cried a little on the inside, because this is what my life had become, evidence collection instead of Sunday dinners. But when the sheet showed a box forwarded to a P.O. box 2 blocks away, one I had never authorized, the room tasted like victory. That night after they left, I opened a drawer and took out an old checkbook. It was ragged at the edges, the kind we used before plastic became king. I flipped to a check from 1998, where my signature jumped off the paper in a lazy, confident loop. I set it beside the forged signatures Clara came over with tape and bright lights, and we placed them side by side under magnification. The differences were a language all their own. I had a rhythm, they had an imitation, but the noise beneath the paper was louder than the signature. When Clara lifted a page and held it to the lamp, the indents told a story someone had traced, someone had used a guide. Someone had gone to a notary who was willing to look away. I thought of Tom the notary, who helped at odd hours. There was a name and a number attached to his stamp. I scribbled it down. I also dug out my old camera, an ugly box that had been my companion on fishing trips. At 72, a man's tools are memory and stubbornness. I drove to the P.O. box on West Central and waited in the car, watching the tiny parking lot. A woman walked out carrying a stack of envelopes. She loaded them into a dark SUV with a bumper sticker that read, "Family First." It was the same SUV Mrs. Klein had mentioned. The woman smiled and waved at me in the rearview mirror like she owned my attention. I could have called the police then, or stormed the lot. But I wanted more than noise. I wanted the thing that would make a judge sit up and listen. I wanted to show not only that they'd done it, but how they'd done it, who had helped them, who had notarized it, What accounts had been moved? The law is a ladder I had to climb, rung by rung. So I filed subpoenas. The bank resisted, at first bound by privacy and easy forms. But after the Elise Pendens and a lawyer, with the voice of a man who eats paperwork for breakfast, the documents began to arrive. Deposit slips routing changes, notary logs with timestamps, voicemail transcripts. One envelope had a scanned receipt for a motel room, 2 towns over, booked under Mark's name, dated 3 days before the deed transfer. I started to realize something bigger was at play. This wasn't a spur-off-the-moment theft. It was an operation messy but organized, and it involved people outside the family. The thought settled over me like frost. If they were willing to involve strangers, then their reach and audacity were wider than I'd imagined. The next morning, as the first gray light seeped through my kitchen curtains, I sat at the oak table and spread the newly acquired documents like a deck of cards. My hands steadied as I traced the paper lines with a finger. They had taken my house once. Now I would take everything back. A single piece of paper fell from the stack and fluttered like a trapped moth. On it was a notary acknowledgement stamped with a county seal and a scribbled name I'd seen before. Tom, beneath his signature, was an address. I knew where I would go that afternoon. I told Clara to meet me at the old bridge on Summit Street. We didn't speak much on the drive. I felt like a man walking into a room where the furniture might change every minute. At the bridge, she handed me a small envelope. Warm from the lawyer's hands inside was a subpoena for Tom's notary logs and an instruction: serve with discretion. When I drove up to Tom's little office, he was not alone. Sitting in a chair with his back to the window was a familiar silhouette, one I never wanted to see in my house again. He looked up, and our eyes met. There was a smile that meant business, and a calm, so practiced it made my stomach hollow. "Mr. Hayes," he said, as if we were meeting for coffee. "Hello, Tom," I said. "Mind if I come in?" He straightened as if he'd been expecting me. The door closed behind me, and for the first time since I discovered the forged signatures, my pulse rose, not from fear, but from anticipation. I'd set the trap. Now I would see who stepped in. You said continue. Next, ChatGPT said, "This really happened to me, not a tale borrowed from a book, not something whispered secondhand. It happened in my town, in my bloodline, in the air I still breathe. Recounting it drags me back to a room that smelled like paper, ink, and fear." The paper sat on the oak kitchen table under the dim light, its edges crisp, its ink bold, but the signatures at the bottom, me name, scrawled there 3 times, were not mine. My own children. The ones I raised, the ones who called me dad when they scraped their knees, had forged my hand to steal what I had sweated for. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. When Tom looked at me that day, sitting in his little notary office on Broadway, the air between us was taut. His office smelled like stale coffee and ink pads. Behind him was a file cabinet dented on the side, the kind that kept secrets tucked behind cold steel. I laid the subpoena on his desk, sliding it across like a poker chip. "You'll want to comply," I said, my voice steady. He gave a practiced smile, the kind worn by men who think they have friends in every corner. "Mr. Hayes, I don't know what you've been told, but everything I notarize is above board. If your kids signed something, I had ID. That's my job." I leaned forward. "Except you notarized documents at 11 o'clock at night in a motel on Reynolds Road. You stamped papers that were already filled out, papers transferring property I never authorized. I've got witness statements. I've got handwriting analysis. And now I've got a subpoena for your logbook. Either you hand it over, or we can let a judge ask you the same questions under oath." For the first time, I saw the flicker of fear behind the arrogance. He shifted, cleared his throat. "Give me a day." He said. I gave him nothing. "You've got till the end of the week." When I walked out, the autumn air tasted sharper. Clara was waiting in her car. She rolled down the window and asked, "Did he bite?" "He's rattled," I said. "That's enough for now." The days that followed were a chess match. My children thought I was cornered, an old man stumbling through paperwork, but I was collecting knights and rooks one by one. The law was on my side now. My lawyer filed motions with Lucas County Probate Court, pushing to void the transfer. We also prepared criminal charges, forgery fraud, elder exploitation. The word elder stung my pride, but I let it stand, because sometimes you have to use the very label they stick on you to fight back. Meanwhile, Clara and I pieced together the financial angle. From the bank records we traced how Mark had siphoned off small amounts from my pension into a joint account. Lisa had set up Anjar LLC, Hayes Property Management, where my house had been sold at a cut-rate price. That company was nothing but a shell, with her name and Mark's wife as partners. It was designed to funnel money, plain and simple. The deeper we dug, the more arrogant their scheme looked. They weren't careful. They had used their own addresses, their own emails, their own phones. They had assumed no one would look. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Lisa and Mark showed up at my house one Friday evening unannounced. The streetlights glowed weak outside the window. They didn't knock. They just let themselves in with a spare key. Lisa's heels clicked against the hardwood. "Dad, we need to talk." Mark followed, arms crossed, chin tilted like a man who thinks he already won. "You've been making a lot of noise. Lawyers' subpoenas, calls to the bank. It's not healthy." I looked at them from my recliner, the TV off the table beside me stacked with copies of their lies. "Sit down," I said. Lisa sat crossing her legs. Mark leaned on the wall. "You forged my name," I said flat. "You stole from me, and you thought I wouldn't fight back. But you were wrong." Lisa's eyes narrowed, and for the first time her sweet voice cracked. "Dad, you don't understand. You're old, you can't manage these things anymore. We did what was best." "No," I said, my voice rising. "You did what was best for you. You sold my house. You rerouted my checks. You made me into a ghost in my own life." Mark's smirk faltered. "So what now? You gonna drag your own kids into court? You'll look pathetic. The neighbors will pity you." I leaned forward. "Better pitied than robbed. And when the judge sees your signatures, your emails, your bank transfers, and Tom's logbook, pity will be the least of your worries." They froze. They hadn't known about Tom yet. Their eyes darted at each other. I smiled, slow and deliberate. "Games changed. You're not untouchable anymore." That night they left without another word, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. But I knew then that the war was no longer in whispers. It was open. The next morning my lawyer called Bob. "We got a court date. Emergency hearing. 2 weeks, be ready." I was ready. For 72 years, I'd lived as a worker, a husband, a father. Now I was something new, a man sharpening truth into a blade, and I promised myself when I stepped into that courtroom, I would not only take back what was mine, I would leave them with nothing but the ashes of their arrogance. That week I stood outside the Lucas County Courthouse looking up at the tall columns and whispered to myself, "They wanted to bury me in forged ink. I'll bury them in the truth." What I didn't know yet was how far they would go when cornered, and how dangerous a desperate thief can become when they realize the walls are closing in. Would you like me to push straight into the courtroom showdown and escalation phase next, where their power is tested against the judge and the evidence begins to land heavy? Or would you prefer I linger a little longer on the pre-court mind games and traps I set for them before the hearing. You said continue next. ChatGPT said, this really happened to me, not a tale passed down, not a fabrication for thrills. It happened in my own county courthouse, under fluorescent lights that buzzed like nervous wasps. Even now, remembering the air in that room makes my palms sweat. The paper sat on the oak kitchen table under the dim light, its edges crisp, its ink bold, but the signatures at the bottom, me name scrawled there 3 times, were not mine. My own children, the ones who had eaten at that same table, had forged my hand to erase me. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. 2 weeks later, I walked through the heavy glass doors of the Lucas County Courthouse, my lawyer Alan at my side. The halls smelled of floor polish and tension. I'd been in that courthouse once before, for jury duty in the 80s. But this time, my entire life was sitting in manila folders, under Alan's arm. Lisa and Mark were already inside the courtroom. When we arrived, Lisa wore a navy blazer, her hair pulled back, like she was auditioning for sainthood. Mark leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at his lips, tapping his pen like a man waiting for the world to applaud him. They had a lawyer, too slick suit, gelled hair, smug smile. His name was Mr. Kent, and he carried himself like he'd never lost a case against an old man. When the bailiff called the session to order, the judge entered. Stern woman named Judge Ellison, known in Toledo for her no-nonsense rulings. She looked at us all with eyes like cold steel. Alan stood. First, Your Honor. We are here because my client, Robert Hayes, has been the victim of forgery and fraud. His children, Lisa and Mark Hayes, illegally transferred his property and rerouted his finances, using forged signatures. We will prove this with handwriting analysis, financial records, and witness testimony. Kent rose with oily confidence. Your Honor, this is a sad case of an elderly gentleman confused about his own decisions. Mr. Hayes willingly signed the documents in question, but now perhaps under the influence of others, he is misremembering. My clients, his loving children, only acted in his best interest. I clenched my fists under the table. Loving children, he called them. The judge leaned forward. Well, see the evidence. Alan began with the handwriting analysis. Clara, in her pressed gray suit, took the stand. She laid out enlarged copies of my real signature next to the forgeries. She spoke with precision, pointing out hesitation marks, pressure differences, and even microscopic tremors in the pen strokes. These signatures were traced, she said firmly. They do not match Mr. Hayes' natural writing rhythm. In my 40 years as a forensic handwriting expert, I can state with professional certainty that they are forgeries. Kent tried to cross-examine. Isn't it possible? Mr. Hayes' hand simply shook that day. Clara didn't blink. No. The strokes indicate slow tracing, not natural tremor. They are deliberate imitations. The judge nodded, her eyes lingering on the side-by-side exhibits. Next came the bank records. Alan handed over proof of the rerouted pension checks, the P.O. box forwarding, and the LLC funneling money through Hayes Property Management. The paper trail was undeniable. Kent objected, muttering about family arrangements. The judge silenced him with a raised hand. Then came Mrs. Klein. My neighbor, with her hair in a tight bun, testified about seeing the SUV at night, the movers carting things out, the suspicious behavior. Her voice cracked, but her words were steady. I've lived across the street for 30 years. Mr. Hayes never authorized this. His children have been taking advantage of him. Lisa squirmed. Mark's smirk faltered. But the knockout came when Alan called Tom the notary. He walked in with slumped shoulders, clutching his logbook like it might explode. Under subpoena, he had no choice. Alan's questions were sharp. "Mr. Tom, did you notarize the documents transferring Robert Hayes' property?" "Yes," he muttered. "At what time and location?" Tom hesitated. Judge Ellison's gaze bore into him. Finally, he sighed. "It was late, around 11, at a motel. They brought the papers already filled out. And did you see Robert Hayes sign them with your own eyes?" Tom swallowed hard. "No, I trusted the family." The courtroom gasped. My children's lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him again. Alan pressed further. "So you knowingly notarized signatures without the signer present. That's a violation of Ohio law, correct?" Tom nodded, defeated. The judge scribbled notes, her lips tight. I could feel the shift in the room like a gust of cold wind. When it was my turn to testify, I stood and looked directly at my children. My voice shook at first, but steadied as the truth rolled out. I raised Lisa and Mark with my wife Helen, in the house they stole. We scraped and saved for that home. I never signed those papers. My children forged my name and tried to take my life's work. If this court lets that stand, then anyone can erase a man with a pen. But I won't be erased. Silence filled the room. Even Kent looked rattled. Judge Ellison leaned back. "I've heard enough closing statements tomorrow. But let me say this. Fraud against family is still fraud. And forging signatures is a crime in my courtroom." Lisa's face drained of color. Mark's jaw tightened. That night I went home to the house they thought they'd stolen and sat at the oak table once again. I traced my fingers over the grain of the wood, whispering to myself. They thought I was too old, too weak. But tomorrow the gavel will fall, and when it does, the sound will be their undoing. What I didn't realize was that before the gavel came down, they would try one last desperate move. Something reckless enough to put more than money on the line. Do you want me to move directly into the climax, the final day in court, and their desperate last strike, or expand first on the desperate measures they attempted outside the courtroom before the verdict? You said continue. Next ChatGPT said, "This really happened to me, not a rumor, not a story borrowed to scare children. It happened in Toledo, Ohio, under gray skies and cracked sidewalks. I'd walked for decades. The memory still presses heavy on my chest, like a stone." The paper sat on the oak kitchen table under the dim light, its edges crisp, its ink bold. But the signatures at the bottom, my name scrawled there 3 times, were not mine. My own children, the ones I once carried on my shoulders through summer fairs, had forged my hand to erase me. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The night before the final court session, the storm came. Not weather, though rain lashed the windows, but desperation carried on. My children's voices. It started with a pounding at the door. When I opened it, Mark shoved past me, dripping wet, his eyes bloodshot. Lisa followed, her hair plastered against her face. "Dad, listen," Lisa pleaded. "You don't have to go through with this. Drop it. We'll give you back the house. We'll fix everything." I stared at them, my heart hammering. "Now you want to fix it, after you stole from me, after you forged my name and tried to erase me." Mark's voice rose. "You don't understand. We were drowning. Debts, loans. This was our only chance. You're sitting on assets while we're suffocating. We had to do it." I stepped back, my hands trembling. "You had to betray your own father." Lisa broke then, tears spilling down her face. "Please, Dad. If this goes to a verdict, we're finished. They'll press charges. We could go to jail." For a moment, the father in me ached. I saw them not as the arrogant thieves they'd become, but as the children I once tucked into bed. But then the weight of everything they'd done slammed back into me. The stolen house, the siphoned accounts, the cold smirks in my own kitchen. I shook my head. You chose greed. You chose lies. Tomorrow the judge chooses truth. Mark's jaw clenched. His eyes darkened. If you do this, you'll regret it. They stormed out, leaving muddy footprints on my floor. I stood there, heart pounding, realizing they weren't just desperate, they were dangerous. The next morning, I entered the courthouse under gray skies that felt like judgment itself. Inside tension clung to the air. The gallery buzzed with whispers. Neighbors, co-workers, even church acquaintances had come. Word had spread. The Hayes family was tearing itself apart in public. Judge Ellison called the court to order. We will hear closing statements. Kent, their lawyer, tried one last performance. He painted me as a confused old man, manipulated by outsiders, a victim of paranoia. He gestured to Lisa, who dabbed her eyes with a tissue. These are children who love their father. Your Honor, mistakes may have been made, but this is not fraud. It is family business. Allen stood and delivered the truth like hammer blows. This is not confusion. This is calculated theft. Mr. Hayes' signatures were forged. His finances rerouted, his property stolen. His own children orchestrated this, and the notary himself admitted under oath he never saw Mr. Hayes sign. Family does not excuse crime. Then it was my turn. The judge gave me the floor, and I rose, every eye on me. I am 72 years old. I said, my voice trembling at first, then growing stronger. I worked the Jeep plant for 40 years. I built my life with sweat calluses and honesty, and the two people I loved most tried to erase me with a pen. If this court allows that, then every parent is vulnerable. Am not confused, am not senile, am their father. And I am here because they betrayed me. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Ellison's gavel struck. I find the transfer of property null and void. The deed is restored to Robert Hayes. Further, I am referring this matter to the county prosecutor for investigation into forgery, fraud, and financial exploitation. Lisa gasped, collapsing into her chair. Mark's face drained of color. Kent's jaw tightened. The courtroom murmured, the sound of justice settling in. But then, in the shuffle of papers and scraping of chairs, Mark snapped. He stood abruptly, pointing at me, his face twisted with rage. You think you've won? This isn't over, old man. He shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. The bailiff moved quickly, grabbing his arm. Lisa sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I stood tall, my chest heaving, and looked directly at them. It's over. You tried to steal my life. Now you'll face the law. When I walked out of the courthouse, the autumn air felt cleaner, sharper. The house was mine again. My name was restored. But the victory didn't taste sweet. It tasted bittersweet, like ashes mixed with rain. Because revenge doesn't give you back what you lost. It only ensures the thieves can't take more. I went home that night, sat at the oak kitchen table where it had all begun, and whispered to the silence. They tried to erase me with forged ink, but in the end, it was their names that were ruined, and you'll never forget the sound of that gavel, echoing like thunder as their world collapsed. Would you like me to continue into the chilling resolution, the aftermath, how the prosecutor handled them, and the final haunting closing line, or should I linger more on their downfall in the community, how neighbors and friends turned on them after the verdict? You said continue. Next, ChatGPT said, this really happened to me, not a fable, not a tale spun from imagination. It happened in the very streets it walked since childhood, in the community where everyone knew the Hayes family by name. Even now, when I pass someone who whispers about it, I feel the sting. The paper sat on the oak kitchen table under the dim light, its edges crisp, its ink bold, but the signatures at the bottomy name scrawled there 3 times were not mine. my own children. The ones who had once laughed in this kitchen had forged my hand to erase me. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The court battle ended, but the war spilled into everyday life. In Toledo, news travels like wildfire, especially when it involves betrayal. The local paper didn't print names, but people put the pieces together. Elderly man wins back stolen house after forgery case. It was enough. Neighbors looked at Lisa and Mark differently. Friends stopped returning their calls. Even the church they grew up in, St. Paul's Lutheran, went cold toward them. At the grocery store on Secor Road, I overheard whispers that's him, the father they tried to cheat. Strangers nodded at me with a kind of respect, but also pity. And when Lisa walked in one morning, clutching her basket, people turned away. She left in tears. But the humiliation wasn't just social. The prosecutor's office moved quickly. Forgery, fraud, elder exploitation. They stacked the charges like bricks. I didn't need to testify again. The evidence already sang loud. When subpoenas hit Mark's accounts, they discovered more credit cards maxed in my name, small loans taken with my forged signature. The arrogance had been bottomless. One evening, Alan called Bob. They're facing prison. The state wants to make an example. Do you want to press for the harshest sentence? I sat at my kitchen table, the oak grain beneath my fingertips, staring at a picture of Helen on the wall. I thought about mercy, about whether my wife would want me to forgive. But then I remembered standing in this same spot, holding papers with forged signatures, realizing my children had made me into a ghost. Let the law take them, I said. Lisa took a plea. Deal probation, restitution, community service. She would never work in finance again. Her license was revoked. Mark fought longer, cursing me in the hallway when we crossed paths. But when the bank records came out, he had no shield left. The judge sentenced him to 3 years. The day he was led away in handcuffs, he glared at me with eyes I barely recognized. For a moment I felt something break inside me. Not triumph, not sorrow, just emptiness. Because revenge doesn't restore, it punishes life. Quieted after that, but it never returned to what it was. The neighbors checked on me more often. The church ladies brought casseroles. My house was safe. My accounts mine again, but my family. The blood of my blood was shattered. Sometimes I sit in the living room and hear Helen's voice in my memory. Family is everything. Bob and I whisper back. It was Helen until it wasn't. The oak table still sits under the dim kitchen light. I've kept the forged papers in a drawer, not because I need them, but because they remind me. They remind me that trust once broken never heals the same way. And when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the sound of the judge's gavel, echoing like thunder in that courthouse, marking the day I stopped being just a father and became something colder. And the chilling truth is this: I won the battle. I kept my house. I proved the lies. But when your children betray you, there's no victory, only survival. And I will carry that silence with me until my last breath. The end.